Greetings on our channel. For decades, the global narrative has been dominated by a single powerful image: the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinian Arabs during the birth of the State of Israel. This story is often told as a tragedy of expulsion and ethnic cleansing, a foundational sin that continues to fuel conflict. But when the heavy iron doors of the archives swing open, and the yellowed pages of intelligence reports from 1948 are laid bare under the lamp, a far more complex and unsettling truth begins to emerge. It is a story not of a planned genocide, but of a calculated political sacrifice where ordinary people were used as pieces on a grand, bloody chessboard. Today, we peel back the layers of propaganda to separate the manufactured myth from the documented reality of the First Arab-Israeli War. So, let's begin. The heat in the spring of 1948 was already stifling, a thick, dusty air that hung over the coastal plains and the Judean hills alike. In the cramped, tobacco smoke-filled rooms of the Jewish Agency in Jerusalem and the temporary offices in Tel Aviv, the tension was visceral. It was a time of impossible choices. On the 14th of May, 1948, as a British mandate drew its final breath, the world watched a small sliver of land on the Mediterranean. The air was filled with the scent of blooming orange groves and the metallic tang of oiled weapons. David Ben-Gurion, a man whose every movement seemed dictated by the weight of 3,000 years of history, stood before a small crowd in the Tel Aviv Museum. His voice, captured on grainy recordings now preserved in the state archives, was steady, yet the gravity of the moment was undeniable. In that historic declaration, a document known to every scholar of the Middle East, there was a specific, deliberate appeal. It was not a command for departure, but an invitation to partnership. The text of the Declaration of Independence, specifically the 13th paragraph, remains a haunting testament to what might have been. It called upon the Arab inhabitants of the State of Israel to preserve peace and participate in the upbuilding of the state on the basis of full and equal citizenship and due representation in all its provisional and permanent institutions. These were not the words of a leader seeking to purge a population. They were the words of a man who knew that the survival of his dream depended on the stability of the land. Ben-Gurion knew that a vacuum would only be filled by the steel of invading armies. Yet, as the ink was drying on the parchment, the roads were already beginning to fill. To understand why, one must look at the city of Haifa in April of 1948. Haifa was the industrial heart of the region, a city where Jews and Arabs had lived in a delicate, often productive symbiosis. When the battle for the city reached its climax, the Jewish leadership did something that defies the modern narrative of expulsion. The mayor of Haifa, Shabtai Levi, a man of quiet dignity and deep roots in the community, stood in the city hall and literally wept as he pleaded with his Arab neighbors not to leave. He promised them safety, work, and the preservation of their homes. This moment is documented in the reports of the British District Commissioner, Sir George Stockwell, whose dispatches to London remain some of the most objective accounts of the era. Stockwell's notes describe a scene of profound confusion. He observed that the Jewish authorities were making every effort to persuade the Arab population to remain. However, a different force was at work. The Arab Higher Committee, the primary political organ representing the Palestinian Arabs at the time, had issued a different set of instructions. From the safety of Cairo and Damascus, leaders like Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem, were broadcasting a clear and terrifying message. They told the Arab residents of Haifa, Jaffa, and Safed that they must leave immediately. They promised that the departure would be temporary, lasting only a few weeks until the 5 professional Arab armies, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, would sweep the Zionist forces into the sea. The logic of the Arab leadership was as cold as it was strategic. In the military planning rooms of the Arab League, the presence of a large Arab civilian population was seen as a hindrance to the coming invasion. They needed clear paths for their tanks and artillery. More importantly, they needed a humanitarian crisis to justify their intervention to the international community. They wanted the world to see a flood of refugees, a tide of human misery that could be blamed entirely on the newly declared Jewish state. This was the birth of the refugee weapon, a tool of political warfare that would be honed over the next 8 decades. The people of Haifa were told that if they stayed, they would be traitors. If they left, they would return as conquerors to claim the spoils of the defeated Jews. A young intelligence officer in the Haganah, working in a nondescript basement in Tel Aviv, spent his nights translating intercepted radio transmissions. His reports, now filed in the Israel Defense Forces archives under the classification of the Shai, the pre-state intelligence service, reveal the chilling nature of these broadcasts. One transcript from late April 1948 records an Arab leader screaming into a microphone that every Arab who remained under the Jewish flag would be considered a collaborator and would face the same fate as the Zionist. The fear was infectious. It wasn't just the fear of the Jews. It was the fear of their own leadership and the looming shadow of the invading armies. The Exodus was not a movement of people fleeing a massacre, but a movement of people following a disastrous command. This reality is echoed in the memoirs of those who were there. Consider the account of a driver named Yitzhak, who worked for the British administration and later the Jewish Agency. In his private diaries, which surfaced years later, he described driving his truck through the streets of Jaffa in May 1948. He saw Jewish soldiers using loudspeakers, not to order people out, but to tell them to stay, to keep their shops open, to maintain the peace. He also saw the local Arab notables, men who had been the backbone of the community, being ushered into cars by armed members of the Arab militias, forced to leave against their will. The tragedy was not that they were pushed out by the Jews, but that they were pulled away by their own. The numbers tell a story that the modern political narrative often seeks to obscure. While the figure of 5 million refugees is frequently cited today, this is a product of a unique United Nations definition that includes descendants in perpetuity, a definition applied to no other refugee group in history. In 1948, the number of Arabs who left the territory that became Israel was approximately 500,000 to 600,000. At the very same moment, an almost identical number of Jews were being forcibly expelled from their ancestral homes in Baghdad, Cairo, Aden, and Tripoli. This was a massive, unintended exchange of populations, a common, if brutal, occurrence in the post-war world, similar to what happened between India and Pakistan or in the Sudetenland. Yet the outcomes for these two groups could not have been more different. The Jewish refugees, arriving in the fledgling state with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the trauma of the Farhud or the Egyptian purges, were integrated. They were given citizenship, taught the language, and folded into the fabric of the nation. They became the doctors, the engineers, and the farmers of the __quote _1__. Israel did not keep them in camps to use as political leverage. It saw them as brothers and sisters returning home. The Arab states, conversely, took a different path. They refused to integrate their Palestinian brethren. In Lebanon, Syria, and even the Jordanian-occupied West Bank, the refugees were kept in squalid camps, denied basic rights and citizenship. In the dusty archives of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, there are records from the early 1950s that show the deliberate policy of the Arab League to prevent the resettlement of the refugees. They were to remain a wound that would not be allowed to heal. This was confirmed by the statements of Ralph Galloway, a former head of UNRWA in Jordan, who stated plainly that the Arab nations did not want to solve the refugee problem. They wanted to keep it as an open sore, as an affront to the United Nations, and as a weapon against Israel. The refugees were not victims of Israeli aggression, but victims of a broader Arab strategy that prioritized the destruction of Israel over the well-being of their own people. The intelligence files from the 1950s, particularly those from the Mossad's early predecessors, tracked the formation of the first sabotage units within these camps. The quote, two masses, fed a diet of resentment and false promises of return, became the perfect recruiting ground for the Fedayeen. These were the units tasked with crossing the border to burn crops, blow up water pipes, and kill civilians. The refugee problem was not an unfortunate byproduct of the war. It was the intended infrastructure for a permanent, low-intensity conflict. The architects of this policy sat in luxurious offices in Cairo, while the people they claimed to champion rotted in tents in Gaza. A specific document from the British Foreign Office, dated June 1948, provides a devastating look at the situation in the Galilee. The report notes that in village after village, the Arab population fled, not because of any Jewish military action in their vicinity, but because they were told by their village elders that the Iraqi army was about to use their land as a killing zone. They were told to clear the way for the, quote, three of the Jews. When the Jewish forces eventually entered these villages, they often found hot tea still on the tables and livestock wandering the streets. But the people were gone, vanished into the hills on the orders of generals who were hundreds of miles away. David Ben-Gurion's frustration with this reality is evident in his private correspondence. In a letter to his wife Paula, he lamented the emptiness of the Arab quarters, noting that the departure was a tragedy for the land itself. He understood that the absence of the Arab population would be used against the state for generations. He saw the trap being laid. The __quote _4_ of the Israeli leadership was focused on building a functioning society, while the intellect of the surrounding regimes was focused on creating a permanent state of victimhood. The contrast was stark. One side was building schools and hospitals for its refugees, while the other was building myths and training commandos. As the first ceasefire of 1948 took hold, the demographic map of the region had been irrevocably altered. But the cause was not a singular act of expulsion. It was a complex tapestry of fear, bad advice, military necessity, and a cynical long-term plan by the Arab League. The archives show that in places where the Arab population ignored the calls to flee, such as in Nazareth or the villages of the Little Triangle, they remained, eventually becoming the 2 million Arab citizens of Israel who today serve in the Knesset, the Supreme Court, and the hospitals. This fact alone stands as a silent, powerful rebuttal to the myth of a premeditated genocide. If the goal had been ethnic cleansing, why were these populations allowed to stay and flourish? The deeper one digs into the records of the 1948 war, the more one encounters the __, quote, _5__. The orders that were whispered rather than written, the radio broadcasts that were heard but never officially logged by the Arab governments. Yet, the testimonies of the survivors, collected in the oral history projects of universities in the 1970s and 80s, confirm the pattern. They speak of the panic sowed by the rumors of the Deir Yassin incident, which was amplified 1,000-fold by Arab propaganda to terrify the population into flight. The Arab leadership used the tragedy of a single village to trigger a mass exodus, a psychological operation that backfired on their own people. In the shadows of the military headquarters in Tel Aviv, known as the Kiryah, there is a vault containing the, quote, 6 of the early intelligence services. These are not books of crimes, but books of missed opportunities. They contain the names of Arab leaders who tried to negotiate peace, who tried to tell their people to stay, and who were subsequently assassinated by the Mufti's henchmen. The refugee crisis was enforced by blood, not just Jewish blood, but the blood of any Arab who dared to envision a future of coexistence. The intimidation was total. The choice for the average Palestinian Arab in 1948 was not between Israel and a Palestinian state, but between fleeing or facing the wrath of the invading Arab kings. As the sun set over the ruins of the old city of Jaffa in the late summer of 1948, the silence was deafening. The vibrant markets were gone, replaced by the patrolling squads of the fledgling Israel Defense Forces. The soldiers, many of them survivors of the Holocaust who had arrived only weeks before, looked at the empty houses with a mix of confusion and sadness. They had come from a continent where their homes had been stolen and their families murdered, and now they found themselves in a land where the previous inhabitants had vanished into the night, lured away by the false promises of their own leaders. The tragedy was unfolding in real time, but the narrative was already being rewritten in the capitals of the world. The international press, gathered in the bars of the King David Hotel, began to send out stories of the, quote, 7. They saw the misery, but they rarely asked why it was happening. They didn't report on the pleas of the Jewish mayors or the specific commands of the Arab Higher Committee. The image of the refugee became a convenient shorthand for a conflict that was far more nuanced. It was easier to blame the new state than to examine the failures and the cruelties of the established Arab regimes. The myth was taking root, watered by the tears of the displaced and the ambitions of the powerful. Meanwhile, in the ports of Haifa and Tel Aviv, a different kind of arrival was taking place. Ships from Europe and North Africa were unloading thousands of Jewish refugees every day. These people had no right of return to the homes they had been forced to flee in Baghdad or Tripoli. There was no UN agency dedicated solely to their welfare. They were simply absorbed. The archives of the Jewish Agency from 1949 described the immense strain on the young state's economy, yet there was never a question of turning them away or keeping them in camps. This was the intellectual and moral core of the new Israel, the belief that people are not weapons, but the very foundation of a nation's future. But the question remained, what happened to the specific orders given by the Arab commanders in the field? For decades, historians have searched for the smoking gun, the written directive that triggered the mass flight. While many documents were destroyed in the chaos of the war, certain fragments remained. A memorandum from the Syrian military attaché in Amman, found in a captured file during the 1967 war, refers back to the Instructions of May 1948 regarding the evacuation of civilian populations to provide maneuverability for the liberating forces. It was a strategic withdrawal that was never intended to be permanent, but became a permanent disaster. The atmosphere in the refugee camps in the early 1950s was one of stagnant desperation. The pride of a people was being slowly eroded by a dependency on international aid, a dependency that was encouraged by the host countries. The contrast with the bustling streets of Tel Aviv or the green fields of the kibbutzim was absolute. One side was moving into the future, using every ounce of intellect and will to survive, while the other was being forced to look backward, staring at the keys to houses that no longer existed, in a land they had been told to leave by the very men who now claimed to be their saviors. In the high-stakes game of Cold War politics that soon followed, the refugee issue became a valuable currency. The Soviet Union, seeking to gain a foothold in the Middle East, found the Palestinian narrative to be a powerful tool for destabilizing the pro-Western leanings of the region. The archives of the KGB, partially opened in the 1990s, reveal how Soviet disinformation campaigns amplified the expulsion narrative, stripping away the context of the Arab invasion and the calls for flight. The tragedy was being repurposed into a global political weapon designed to isolate Israel and branded as a colonial interloper rather than a national liberation movement. The reality of 1948 was a whirlwind of fire and movement. There were instances of local commanders on both sides taking actions that went beyond their orders. There were the horrors of war that always accompany the collapse of an empire. But the overarching truth, documented in the files of the British, the Jews, and even in the frustrated private journals of Arab officers, is that the mass exodus was a structural failure of Arab leadership. It was a choice made in Cairo and Jerusalem by men who were willing to gamble the lives of their people for a victory they could not achieve on the battlefield. As we look back through the lens of 78 years, the details of the specific documents, the Order Number 107 from the Arab Higher Committee, or the Circular to the Villages from the Haganah, remain the bedrock of the historical investigation. They tell a story of a state that wanted to include its neighbors and a coalition of regimes that wanted to erase that state, even if it meant sacrificing their own people to do it. The refugee camps became the monument to that sacrifice, a living testimony to a political strategy that chose perpetual war over a difficult peace. Deep within the vaults of the Israel State Archives, there is a file that remains partially restricted. It contains the minutes of a meeting between David Ben-Gurion and his top advisors in late 1948. In those pages, the Prime Minister reflects on the empty villages. He asks his generals if they could have done more to stop the flight, if the psychological pressure of the war was too much for the civilian mind to bear. His tone is not one of triumph, but of a man realizing that the refugee problem would be the shadow that followed Israel into the next century. He knew then that the truth of what happened in Haifa and Jaffa would be buried under a mountain of carefully constructed myths. The air in the archive room is cool and smells of old paper and ozone. As the researcher turns the final page of the 1948 folder, a small, handwritten note falls out. It is a report from a Jewish scout who entered an Arab village near the Lebanese border in June of that year. He found a group of elderly men who had refused to leave, despite the orders from the Mufti's men. They told the scout that they had lived with the Jews for 50 years and saw no reason to stop now. They were the exception that proved the rule. But the note ends with a chilling observation. The scout heard that a group of armed men from across the border had been seen approaching the village later that night, looking for the traitors who stayed. The shadow of the past is long, and the truth is often more dangerous than the lie. In the quiet corridors of the archives, the documents tell a story of a state that was built on intellect and the will to survive, and a tragedy that was manufactured to ensure it would never know peace. The mystery isn't just in what happened, but in why the world chose to believe only half of the story. The clues are there, buried in the files of the 1940s, waiting for those who are brave enough to look past the slogans and see the cold, hard reality of the chessboard. Somewhere in a locked drawer in a ministry in Amman or Cairo, there are reports that have never seen the light of day. They are the reports of the officers who told their kings that the Jews were not the ones forcing the people out. They are the reports of the men who saw the, quote, 18 being forged in real time. These documents are the final piece of the puzzle, the truth that remains too explosive for the modern world to handle. The whispers of the archive suggest that the true architects of the refugee crisis were not the ones who won the war, but the ones who couldn't afford to lose the peace. The documents remain silent. Yet their weight is felt in every headline and every stone thrown in the Galilee. The investigation into the origins of the 1948 Exodus is not just a search for facts, but a search for the moment the future was stolen from two peoples. As the light flickers in the archive, one can almost hear the echoes of the radio broadcasts from Cairo calling into the night, promising a return that was never meant to happen, while the young state of Israel works desperately to build a home for those who had nowhere else to go. While the silence in the abandoned villages of the Galilee was being filled by the wind, a much louder and more systematic silence was descending upon the ancient Jewish quarters of the Middle East. The departure of the Arab population from the territory of the new state of Israel was only one half of a massive, involuntary population exchange that the world has largely chosen to forget. In the same months that the roads to the north and east were filled with Arab families, the streets of Baghdad, Cairo, and Sana'a were witnessing a mirror image of that tragedy. But where the Arab exodus was triggered by the calls of their own leaders to clear a path for war, the Jewish exodus from Arab lands was a product of state-sponsored persecution and the calculated seizure of property. This was the moment when the, quote, 19 became a two-sided coin, though history has spent decades trying to keep one side face down in the dirt. In the basement of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Jerusalem, there are boxes of documents recovered from the various quote, 20 operations that highlight the systematic nature of this expulsion. In Iraq, a community that had existed since the time of the Babylonian exile, more than 2,500 years, was dismantled in a matter of months. In March of 1950, the Iraqi parliament passed Law Number 1, which stripped any Jew who chose to leave the country of their citizenship and, more importantly, their assets. The archives of the Iraqi intelligence service, the Mukhabarat, which were uncovered decades later in the flooded basements of Baghdad, reveal the meticulous lists of Jewish homes, shops, and bank accounts that were slated for nationalization. The Jewish families were allowed to leave with only one suitcase and the equivalent of $50. Everything else, their history, their wealth, their very identity, was consumed by the state. The intelligence reports from the time describe an atmosphere of terror. A secret dispatch from the British Embassy in Baghdad in October 1951 noted that the pressure on the Jewish community had reached a breaking point, with public hangings and arbitrary arrests becoming common occurrences. Over 120,000 Iraqi Jews were forced to flee, most of them finding their way to the fledgling State of Israel. Simultaneously, in Yemen, a community of nearly 50,000 was being airlifted in Operation On Wings of Eagles. These were people who had never seen an airplane, who arrived in Israel with nothing but the clothes on their backs and ancient Torah scrolls. They were refugees in every sense of the word, yet their story was never turned into a global political cause. The contrast between the two refugee groups began at the border. While the Arab states were actively preventing the integration of Palestinian Arabs, the State of Israel was doing the opposite. The, quote, 21 was being built on a foundation of crisis. In 1949 and 1950, the population of Israel doubled, creating a logistical nightmare that would have crushed a lesser nation. The archives of the Ministry of Labor and the Jewish Agency describe the creation of the Ma'abarot, the transit camps. These were not meant to be permanent symbols of victimhood. They were temporary cities of canvas and corrugated iron, where the new arrivals from Iraq, Morocco, and Poland were housed side by side. The smell of kerosene stoves and wet canvas permeated these camps, but so did the sound of Hebrew being learned in makeshift classrooms. Internal memos from David Ben-Gurion's office show a relentless focus on moving people out of the tents and into permanent housing. He knew that the only way to protect the state was to make its citizens feel like they had a stake in its future. The intellect of the young nation was channeled into innovative agriculture and rapid industrialization to feed and employ the hundreds of thousands of new arrivals. While the United Nations Relief and Works Agency was beginning its work in the West Bank and Gaza, work that would eventually stretch across generations, Israel was dismantling its own refugee camps within a decade. By 1960, the Ma'abarot were largely gone, replaced by the development towns and the expansion of the coastal cities. The Jewish refugees were no longer refugees. They were the backbone of the country. This divergence was not accidental. In the archives of the Arab League, researchers have found the minutes of meetings from the early 1950s where the __quote_22_ was discussed as a strategic asset. One document from 1952 outlines the refusal to grant citizenship to Palestinians in Lebanon and Syria, explicitly stating that their integration would __quote_23_____. The misery of the camps was a policy choice. It was a way to maintain a demographic weapon that could be pointed at the heart of Israel. The Palestinian people were being held hostage by their own allies, kept in a state of perpetual displacement to serve a geopolitical agenda that favored conflict over stability. The legal discrepancy between the two groups is perhaps the most telling piece of evidence. The United Nations created two separate agencies for refugees. The High Commissioner for Refugees was tasked with resettling people around the world and ending their refugee status as quickly as possible. But for the Palestinians, a separate agency was created, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. Under its unique charter, the status of __24__ became hereditary, passed down from father to son. Even to those who had gained citizenship in other countries or who had never set foot in the land. This is the only instance in human history where a refugee population has grown tenfold despite no new displacement having occurred. The archives of the United Nations show that this structure was lobbied for by the Arab states to ensure the problem would never be solved. In 1956, the situation for Jews in Egypt took a similar turn toward the abyss. Following the Suez Crisis, the government of Gamal Abdel Nasser issued a decree declaring Jews as, quote, 25. Within weeks, thousands were expelled, their businesses seized, and their assets frozen. The reports from the Swiss diplomats who handled the departure of Egyptian Jews describe a scene of systematic plunder. Families who had been part of the Egyptian elite for generations were told they had 24 hours to leave. They arrived in the port of Haifa with nothing, joining the hundreds of thousands who had preceded them from Iraq and Yemen. These 600,000 Jewish refugees from Arab lands received no international aid, no dedicated UN agency, and no __quote_26_ to reclaim their stolen properties in Cairo or Baghdad. The sheer scale of the theft is documented in the records of the World Organization of Jews from Arab countries. The land and property seized from Jews in the Middle East and North Africa is estimated to be several times the size of the State of Israel itself. Yet in the halls of the United Nations, the narrative remains focused solely on the 500,000 Arabs who left Israel in 1948. The archives show a deliberate effort to separate these two events, to present the Palestinian exodus in a vacuum while ignoring the simultaneous and larger expulsion of Jews. It is a historical erasure that has fueled the myth of Israel as a colonial intruder rather than a refuge for a persecuted and indigenous people returning to their home. A retired intelligence officer who served in the Mossad during the 1960s once recalled a folder in the __quote_27_ division that dealt with the legal claims of the Mizrahi Jews. The folder contained deeds to property in the center of Baghdad, keys to warehouses in Alexandria, and bank books from Tripoli. The officer noted that these documents were never used as a weapon in the same way the Palestinians used their, quote, 28. Israel chose to focus on the future, on building a high-tech economy and a defensive powerhouse, while the Arab world chose to focus on the grievance of the past. The, quote, 29 was built by people who refused to remain refugees, even when the world tried to define them as such. The mystery of why the Arab leadership in 1948 was so insistent on the evacuation of the Arab population is further illuminated by the captured diaries of Fawzi al-Kawukji, the commander of the Arab Liberation Army. In his writings, he expresses a deep contempt for the local Arab villagers, viewing them as obstacles to his military maneuvers. He describes the civilian population as a burden that should be moved, quote, _30, to allow for a total war against the Jewish settlements. These diaries, now part of the historical record, confirm that the displacement was a tactical decision by the Arab High Command, not a result of a Jewish policy of expulsion. The people were moved like sandbags to bolster a defensive line that ultimately collapsed. The long-term impact of this strategy is visible in the maps of the Middle East today. The refugee camps in Lebanon and Syria remain as they were decades ago, gray monuments to a failed ideology. Meanwhile, the transit camps of Israel have become the bustling neighborhoods of Ramat Gan and Holon. The archives of the Israeli Ministry of Interior show the rapid naturalization of nearly 1 million people in the first 2 decades of the state's existence. This was a triumph of the intellect and the human spirit over the circumstances of war. It was a refusal to allow a population to be defined by its suffering. The refugee problem was solved in Israel through action and integration, while it was preserved in the Arab world through neglect and political manipulation. In the late 1970s, a secret committee was formed in Jerusalem to document the lost wealth of the Jews from Arab lands. The investigators traveled to Europe to meet with aging exiles, collecting testimonies that read like a funeral oration for a lost civilization. They documented the loss of hundreds of synagogues, thousands of schools, and tens of thousands of businesses. One document, a summary of the committee's findings, estimated the value of the stolen Jewish property at billions of dollars in 1970 currency. This report was kept quiet for years, a dangerous truth that the government feared might complicate future peace negotiations. It was a reminder that the account of 1948 has never been fully settled. The shadow of the refugee weapon continues to loom over every attempt at peace. The right of return, as defined by the Arab League and supported by the unique structure of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, is designed to be an existential threat to the State of Israel. It is the demand that millions of descendants of the original refugees be allowed to flood the country, effectively ending the Jewish state through demographics. The archives of the peace negotiations from the 1990s show that this issue was the ultimate poison pill, inserted into every draft by those who did not want the conflict to end. It was the legacy of the 1948 strategy, still being used to prevent the recognition of a Jewish sovereign state. As we walk through the quiet halls of the National Library in Jerusalem, we find the personal papers of several Arab notables from Haifa who chose to stay in 1948 despite the threats. Their letters describe a difficult but ultimately successful integration into the new state. They speak of the challenges of military rule in the early years, but also of the opportunity to build a new life as citizens of a democracy. These documents are the most potent antidote to the myth of ethnic cleansing. They prove that there was another path, a path of coexistence that was rejected not by the Jews, but by the distant kings and generals who claimed to be the protectors of the Arab cause. The documents also reveal the internal struggles within the United Nations during the early 1950s. Some officials warned that creating a permanent hereditary refugee status for the Palestinians would create a state within a state and prevent any lasting peace. Their warnings were ignored. The archives of the United Nations General Assembly show how the voting bloc of the Arab states, supported by the Soviet Union, systematically blocked any attempt to reform the refugee agency or to encourage resettlement. The humanitarian crisis was too valuable to be solved. It was the intellectual use of human misery as a tool of international law, a perversion of the very concept of refugee protection. In the modern era, the intelligence services of Israel have tracked how the refugee narrative has been exported to the universities and the media of the West. It is a narrative that relies on the total omission of the Jewish refugees and the specific context of the 1948 invasion. The archives of the Ministry of Strategic Affairs contain thousands of examples of how the myth of expulsion is used to delegitimize the State of Israel. It is a psychological war that has been going on for 78 years, and its primary weapon is the suppression of the documented historical truth. The truth that the refugee crisis was a product of Arab aggression and a calculated political sacrifice of their own people. The investigation into the events of 1948 always returns to the same point: the files that are still missing. The archives of the Arab Higher Committee, if they still exist, likely contain the final proof of the orders given to the population of Jaffa and Haifa. The reports of the Syrian and Egyptian commanders, locked away in military vaults, likely describe the disappointment when the temporary exodus turned into a permanent defeat. These are the missing pieces of the puzzle, the documents that would finally put the myth of Israeli-instigated refugee problems to rest. But as long as the conflict is useful to the regimes in the region, those files will remain hidden from the light of day. The State of Israel remains the state of the future, not because it is perfect, but because it chose to build rather than to mourn. It took the broken fragments of the Jewish world, the survivors of the camps in Europe and the refugees from the palaces of the East, and fused them into a single resilient nation. It used its intellect to turn a desert into a garden and a tiny territory into a global leader in technology and security. The refugee crisis of 1948 was a tragedy, but it was a tragedy forced upon the region by those who could not accept the return of the Jewish people to their land. The archives prove that the hand of friendship was extended and then slapped away by those who preferred the darkness of the camps to the light of a new state. The wind still blows through the ruins of the old villages, and the sun still sets over the modern towers of Tel Aviv. The past is never truly gone. It is written in the ink of the archives and the memories of those who survived. The investigation into the refugee problem reveals a landscape of manufactured myths and documented truths, where the real victims were used as pawns in a game they never asked to play. The truth of 1948 is not a simple story of expulsion, but a complex account of a people who returned home and a leadership that chose to burn the house down rather than share it. In a small office in the heart of Jerusalem, an elderly archivist places a folder back onto a shelf. It is a folder containing the original, signed copies of the 1948 Declaration and the subsequent appeals to the Arab population. He knows that these papers will outlast the propaganda and the slogans. He knows that the truth has a weight of its own, a gravity that eventually pulls the layers of lies away. The refugee problem remains an open wound, but the records show who held the knife and who tried to provide the bandage. The truth is there, etched in the yellowed paper, for anyone with the intellect and the courage to find it. The researcher leaves the building and walks out into the cool evening air of Jerusalem. The city is a hive of activity, a testament to the endurance of a people who have faced expulsion for millennia and finally found their way home. The mystery of the refugees is not a mystery of what happened, but a mystery of why the world refuses to see it. The files are there, the witnesses have spoken, and the history is written. The real danger is not in the truth itself, but in the silence that continues to surround it. On the desk in the archive, under the glow of a single lamp, lies a single black and white photograph of a Jewish family from Baghdad stepping off a plane in 1951, clutching a single wooden suitcase.